Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of pure mechanical precision. Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at it and says it's broken.
Right. It is the absolute definition of a clean binary answer. We naturally crave that kind of visible, easily categorized reality in, well, almost every human system.
Exactly. But then you step away from the x-ray machine, and you get into the world of human psychology, institutional self-preservation, and the legal system. And suddenly that diagnostic landscape is just incredibly murky.
Oh, absolutely. We are looking at some seriously muddy waters, which is why our mission for this deep dive today is completely unique. We aren't just looking at a legal case from one perspective.
No, we took the analyses of 6 of the world's most powerful AI models. We're talking Grok, Gemini, ChatGPT, Copilot, DeepSeek, and Qwen. And we cross-reference all of them to find their unanimous consensus on a single, fascinating, real-world collision.
The sources we're feeding into this deep dive center on Dr. Chen Jingyuan. He's a physics and complex systems PhD who was sentenced to 20 months in prison for his online behavior.
Yeah, 20 months.
Right. And we're analyzing the profound psychological and legal mechanics of what happens when a highly complex, nuanced individual mind goes up against a high-pressure, incredibly risk-averse system.
Now, before we jump into the timeline, I want to make a quick but very important note for you listening. Because the source material we're discussing today contains politically charged content, neither of us will be taking any political sides.
Yeah, that's crucial to point out.
Right. We are impartially reporting the AI model's analysis
Yeah.
and simply conveying the ideas contained in the original source material. We aren't endorsing any viewpoints here. Our goal is purely to map out the psychological blind spots and the systemic mechanics at play.
Exactly. We're looking strictly at the how and the why of the behavioral psychology and the legal arguments. We're leaving the politics completely at the door.
Okay, let's unpack this. Here are the foundational facts we're working with. Dr. Chen, born in 1976, used a VPN between 2019 and 2022 to retweet fewer than 100 posts.
And his account had an audience of fewer than 100 followers, so a tiny footprint.
Literally microscopic. And the content he curated was a complete mix. There was some art, like a digital comic of a girl holding an umbrella.
Right.
There were emotional expressions, like a simple image of a candle. He had some academic commentary and historical data, like an image of an old pension payslip.
The AI analyses consistently flag this digital footprint as just utterly microscopic. I mean, this wasn't a massive influencer broadcasting original incendiary manifestos to millions of people.
No, not at all.
He was quietly curating existing publicly available content for an audience you could basically fit inside a small coffee shop.
Which immediately raises the core question of this entire deep dive. How does a handful of retweets by a scientist with virtually no audience trigger a 20-month prison sentence?
Right, and answering that requires us to build a psychological profile of the two characters in this story. On one side, we have the doctor, and on the other, we have the system.
Okay, so let's start with the doctor. What did the model say about him?
Well, Copilot provided this really comprehensive general psychology profile of Dr. Chen. It paints a picture of a mind operating on a frequency that was just completely alien to his interrogators.
Oh, interesting. Alien what way?
Copilot's analysis highlights that Dr. Chen operates on what developmental psychologists call post-formal thinking. He is highly mature and stable in how he processes information.
Wait, so post-formal thinking isn't just about raw intelligence, right? It sounds like it's about being comfortable in the gray areas. Like he doesn't need to force the world into rigid categories of good and bad.
That captures the essence perfectly, yeah. It's actually considered the most advanced stage of adult cognitive development. A post-formal thinker accepts uncertainty. They tolerate inherent contradictions.
They could just sit with the ambiguity.
Exactly. They can hold multiple conflicting perspectives at the exact same time without feeling a sense of psychological threat.
That makes a lot of sense for a scientist.
It does. And when we apply that framework to his retweets, the AI models unanimously agree there was no underlying malice. These were exploratory, knowledge-seeking behaviors.
Just a researcher gathering disparate data points to form a broader understanding of the world. He's essentially building a mental library, right? A candle here, a pension payslip there.
Exactly, a mental library.
But this is where the friction starts for me. Because if a court is supposed to be the ultimate rational actor, weighing evidence, examining facts, they shouldn't be terrified of a mental library. Aren't courts supposed to be rational?
What's fascinating here is how systems themselves behave when placed under intense hierarchical pressure. The AI models map the psychological profile of the institutional environment as well.
And what did they find?
They found a severe condition of low ambiguity tolerance, paired with a high need for cognitive closure.
Meaning the system is terrified of the gray areas. They need a simple answer, and they need it yesterday.
Precisely. When an institution becomes hypersensitive to risk, its internal mechanisms just cannot process nuance. It activates this cognitive risk amplification mechanism.
So suddenly, any blurry or ambiguous behavior isn't just confusing, it's a threat.
Yes. It is interpreted as a direct active hazard. The institution attempts to lower its own perceived risk by forcing highly complex behavior into a simplistic, easily punishable box.
Wow. It feels like trying to run a next-generation quantum algorithm on a 1990s pocket calculator. The calculator doesn't just fail to understand the math, it actively errors out.
That is a brilliant analogy.
The system literally lacked the cognitive framework to process a mind more complex than its own. So they look at a scientist's natural academic skepticism, and the calculator outputs deliberate malice.
Right, and they look at his authenticity, his refusal to just blindly agree with their narrative. And the calculator outputs bad attitude. The pocket calculator analogy perfectly describes the structural inevitability of this clash. A system built on binary operations, guilty or innocent, compliant or subversive, it just cannot process quantum superpositions.
So they just break down.
Exactly. The misread of his intentions wasn't an accidental oversight, it was a fundamental feature of how the system processes information.
But when a calculator errors out, it doesn't just stop. In a legal system, it starts aggressively categorizing. And I know the models, specifically DeepSeek and Gemini, dove deep into how this risk-averse mindset infected the specific decision-making of the police, prosecutors, and judges.
They did. Once the system slapped the label of disruptor on Dr. Chen, it triggered a massive cascade of cognitive biases, starting with intense confirmation bias.
Right, because once they have the label, they only look for things that fit the label.
Exactly. The documentation shows the authorities focusing obsessively on the mere presence of the retweets, while completely filtering out the physical reality of the situation.
They ignored his microscopic follower count.
They ignored the zero engagement metrics. They even ignored the fact that several of the items he retweeted originated from mainstream official sources.
Because that data just didn't fit the label they just gave him. I was reading through the model's breakdown of the representativeness heuristic. Tell me if I have this right. Is that basically an academic term for stereotyping?
Pretty much, yeah.
Like, the system has this mental caricature of what a subversive troublemaker looks like. And because he retweeted a candle, they just jammed him into that caricature, regardless of the actual statistics.
The heuristic functions exactly like a mental shortcut that bypasses critical thinking. People judge the probability of an event based on how closely it resembles their internal prototype, completely neglecting the actual base rate probabilities.
Okay, so in the court's mind, a subversive uses a VPN and posts alternative content.
Right. And Dr. Chen used a VPN and posted alternative content. Therefore, they concluded he was a severe threat.
While totally ignoring the statistical reality that a node with fewer than 100 followers poses a near-zero probability of causing actual societal disruption.
Exactly. Which leads to the most mind-bending detail in the court documents. The prosecution actually used his PhD against him.
Oh my gosh, yes, this part was wild.
The logic they put on paper was that because Dr. Chen is highly educated, he possesses the intellect to distinguish right from wrong. Therefore, by retweeting these things, he must have intentionally meant to spread rumors.
They literally took his cognitive ability and equated it with criminal intent. It's astonishing.
In behavioral psychology, that is a textbook demonstration of the fundamental attribution error. The prosecutors attributed his actions entirely to internal malicious character flaws while completely erasing the situational context.
They refused to see a researcher navigating a complex information environment. They only saw a villain who, quote, knew better.
Right. It feels like they were saying, he's smart, therefore he's dangerous.
But the actual individuals in that courtroom, the prosecutors, the judges with law degrees, they have to realize this logic is hanging by a thread, right? They have to see the logical leap they're making.
You would think so. But the AI models pull from social psychology to explain this, specifically the work of Stanley Milgram on authority and obedience.
Whoa, the famous shock experiments.
Yes. In a rigid hierarchy, functionaries will easily override their own moral compass to satisfy the demands of an authority figure. The prosecutor in this case actually stated on the record, superiors requested this be made into an ironclad case.
Wow, they just said the quiet part out loud. The verdict was decided before the evidence was even gathered.
Exactly. And to cope with the cognitive dissonance of imprisoning a man based on logical fallacies, the officials engaged in what psychologist Albert Bandura defined as moral disengagement.
Moral disengagement.
Right.
How does that work in this context?
Well, it involves euphemistic labeling. So framing their actions as maintaining social order rather than destroying a scholar's life.
Right. It softens the blow to their own conscience.
It also involves displacing responsibility. By claiming they are merely satisfying the requests of superiors or serving the broader system, the individuals insulate themselves from feeling personal guilt for an unjust outcome.
So what does this all mean? I really want you to imagine sitting in an interrogation chair. The very knowledge you possess, the doctorate you spent your life earning, is being weaponized by the person across the table as definitive proof of your guilt.
It's terrifying.
Your intelligence is literally the evidence of your malice.
And moving from the interrogation room to the courtroom is where this clash of complexities becomes a tangible, documented battle. We have highly ambiguous legal charges colliding with a hyper-rational scientific defense strategy.
The actual charge levied against him was picking quarrels and provoking trouble. I tend to think of this as the junk drawer of the legal code.
The junk drawer. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, when authorities don't have a specific definable crime that fits the behavior, they just toss the defendant into the junk drawer, a pocket crime. But ChatGPT and Quen both analyzed the penal code and pointed out that even this catch-all crime has a strict legal prerequisite.
Right. The behavior must cause severe public order disruption.
Exactly.
The statute requires tangible, measurable harm. It demands evidence of a riot, widespread panic, or the paralysis of digital networks. There must be an objective collapse of order.
Which brings us to how someone with a complex systems PhD actually fights back against a junk drawer charge. Because Dr. Chen didn't just stand up and plead innocent. He didn't beg for mercy.
No, he defended himself using complex systems theory and advanced mathematics. He actually brought up network topology in his defense.
The application of hard science to abstract law here is just remarkable. Dr. Chen utilized network topology to map out the digital environment, right?
He did. He demonstrated that his account existed in what physics calls a deep subcritical zone.
Let's break that down for a second, because this is brilliant. If you have zero engagement and you have fewer than 100 followers, you mathematically lack the physical capacity to trigger a systemic avalanche.
Exactly. It's like dropping a single pebble into a dry riverbed and the prosecution accusing you of trying to cause a catastrophic flood.
Right.
The physics completely dismantle the legal accusation. He didn't just claim he didn't cause a disruption. He proved that, given his position as an isolated node in the network, it was mathematically impossible for his actions to fulfill the legal requirement of severe public order disruption.
Incredible. And he didn't stop there. He also introduced Gödel's incompleteness theorem into his defense.
Yes, he did.
Okay, Gödel's incompleteness theorem. That's the mathematical principle proving that no complex logical system can be entirely complete and perfectly consistent at the same time, right?
That's the one. There will always be paradoxes.
So he's using theoretical math to point out the inherent logical paradoxes in the prosecution's own indictment.
Exactly. He took the prosecution's legal logic and mapped it like a mathematical equation, exposing all the internal contradictions. He showed that their accusations relied on assumptions that literally canceled each other out.
Wow.
And the models also noted his use of the CAP theorem. It's a principle from computer science stating that a distributed data system can only provide 2 of 3 guarantees: consistency, availability, and partition tolerance.
So he's applying computer science to how information flows in society.
He argued that a healthy information ecosystem requires partition tolerance. That's the ability to handle dropped connections or differing viewpoints without the whole system crashing.
Okay, that makes sense.
By demanding absolute rigid consistency in thought across the entire society, the system was actually making itself more fragile and prone to collapse.
It's one of the most elegant, bulletproof defenses I've ever heard. But the tragedy of this deep dive is the system's reaction to it.
Yeah.
Because the judge's response to this absolute masterclass in scientific legal defense was to interrupt Dr. Chen and tell him, shut up, answer yes or no.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that single interruption perfectly encapsulates the psychological mismatch we discussed earlier. The courtroom was never a venue for uncovering objective truth.
No, obviously not.
The court demanded compliance expression. They required the defendant to submit to their simplified narrative. Did you click the button or not? Dr. Chen, however, was offering authentic, complex expression.
Right. It's the pocket calculator just aggressively blinking error and demanding the user stop typing in quantum physics.
The legal system actively abandoned the requirement for objective evidence. Unable to prove any actual disruption to public order, they relied entirely on subjective presumption.
The scientific truth of network topology was basically overwritten by the institutional truth of state authority.
Exactly.
But when a system decides that mathematical proof is irrelevant, the actual rules of the court become irrelevant too. This leads to the complete collapse of procedural justice throughout the entire life cycle of Dr. Chen's case.
Oh, the procedural collapse was total. All 6 AI models were unanimous on the staggering list of procedural violations that occurred once the system decided he was guilty.
And the breakdown of due process is just extensive. Police violently breached his residence without presenting a warrant. He was subjected to 24-hour continuous interrogations where he was deliberately denied food and access to sanitation.
And the trial itself was held in secret. It was closed to both the public and his immediate family without any valid legal justification provided.
And then it gets to the appellate court. The appellate court refused to even hold a hearing. They basically told an imprisoned defendant that the burden of proof was on him to provide new evidence to prove his innocence, rather than forcing the prosecution to prove his guilt.
They completely inverted the entire concept of justice.
They really did.
Analyzing this through the lens of forensic psychology, these procedures are designed to inflict criminal justice trauma. The institution isolates the individual, strips away all procedural fairness, and subjects them to extreme, uncontrollable stress.
Trying to break them down.
Exactly. The psychological goal is to induce learned helplessness, breaking the individual's will to resist.
But despite being locked in that system, Dr. Chen didn't break. While sitting in a prison cell, stripped of his academic resources, his technology, and his freedom, he wrote a 20,000-word blood letter.
20,000 words.
Yeah, it was this massive, meticulously detailed petition and self-defense document.
The creation of that document represents a profound psychological phenomenon called meaning-making. When humans are faced with severe existential threats and trauma that they cannot physically escape, they survive by creating meaning out of the suffering.
He refused to just be a victim in their filing cabinet.
By transforming his confinement into a quest for absolute justice, and by meticulously documenting the logical, scientific, and legal failures of his captors, he was actively protecting his core identity.
He was fighting back with his mind.
Yes, the institution attempted to force the label of criminal onto him. Through the sheer act of writing, he maintained his identity as an independent, rational scholar. He preserved his internal locus of control, dictating his own mental reality, even when he had zero external control over his physical body.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If we zoom out and look at the ultimate consensus of Grok, Gemini, ChatGPT, Copilot, DeepSeek, and Qwen, this isn't just a story about one flawed legal verdict in one specific jurisdiction.
No, it's much bigger than that.
It is a perfectly documented real-world experiment. It shows us exactly what happens when a highly rational, complex individual collides with a rigid, high-pressure system that is absolutely crippled by cognitive bias and institutional fear.
This is a framework I encourage everyone listening to apply to their own environments. Consider your corporate workplace, your academic institution, or your social circles.
Yeah, it happens everywhere.
How frequently do those systems rely on confirmation bias to push through a desired outcome? How often do we witness institutions actively punish complexity or nuanced thinking simply because it feels threatening to a simplified, comfortable narrative?
We see it all the time.
Yeah.
Systems penalize the people asking the hard, nuanced questions because it is vastly easier and cheaper to just demand simple compliance. The physics might be different, but the psychology is identical.
The underlying mechanisms of risk amplification and cognitive closure operate the exact same way in a boardroom as they do in a courtroom.
Which brings me to a final thought I really want you to mull over as you go about your day. Today, we just listened to 6 of the world's most advanced artificial intelligence models perfectly diagnose the logical fallacies, the cognitive biases, and the systemic failures of human judges.
They saw right through the human blind spots.
They systematically identified the exact psychological traps the humans built and subsequently fell into.
It's pretty incredible when you think about it.
So, if human justice systems are this inherently vulnerable to psychological blind spots, to groupthink, to the representativeness heuristic, is there a future where we trust AI to act as a safeguard in our courtrooms?
That is the big question.
Could an AI be the ultimate objective observer, immune to institutional pressure? Or would the system just program the AI to blindly follow its own biases, turning it into a faster, vastly more efficient pocket calculator that just outputs the systemic errors at lightning speed?
Do we finally get that clean binary X-ray of justice, or do we just teach the machine how to muddy the waters? That is the defining question we face as we integrate these models into human systems. Can they elevate our logic, or will they just automate our flaws?
Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the information around you, embrace the complexity, and we will catch you next time.